Good evening, everyone. There's so much that was shared already that's so meaningful. I want to piggyback on some of the ideas that my fellow brother colleagues shared this evening and try to make it more tangible for us and crystallize it, and hopefully we can make it more palatable so we can take the ideas even more deeply into our lives. This Purim, I believe, will be different than any Purim you and I have ever celebrated. And I say that because, it's hard to not think about what's happening in Israel as we're going to be approaching this holiday. Since Purim, the last time we actually had a major simcha was as Jews was Simchat Torah, right? And between that, you had a little bit of Hanukkah, you had some of the fasts in between, and now you have this. Starts with the fast on Thursday, and then on Saturday night, Sunday, you have this day of Simcha. And there are even some opinion pieces that were written in different magazines, different publishing houses about how could we really be celebrating on Purim this year when you have all the hostages and what happened in Israel is so horrifying, all the violence. How can we actually celebrate? Should we cancel parades? Should we cancel our smachot and so on and so forth? Is a conversation that so many people are having in Israel and even here. But the truth is that the story of Purim itself begins with a tremendous amount of violence. Right? The focal point is about how a man who amasses a tremendous amount of power, he leapfrogs in his different government positions and is able to get an audience with the king and demand that, and bribe him actually to create a decree where every single Jew in one sweeping day will be wiped off the map. That the 127 provinces that Achashverosh had under his dominion, he had one day where he could wipe out every single Jew on the planet. That's pretty scary. And the backdrop of all of this, you have to understand, is that the Jews were exiled 70 years earlier. And the exile was, sorry about that, there's something like some sound issue, but I think now that Jessica walked to the issue, it walked away. So she took care of it automatically. Some people just have that knack, they just fix things automatically. So anyway, so you have a story that took place 70 years earlier. Imagine for a moment living in Israel. Okay, you're living in Israel, and you're passing down the house that your ancestors lived in for hundreds of years. Imagine having 1,000 years of history in the land of Israel, because the Jews that were exiled in the beginning of the story of Purim they were the first Jews to experience exile. For 1,000 years living, about 1,000 years living in Israel, and then all of a sudden, gone. And now this is the second generation, born outside, in exile, okay, that's invited to this seudah, this party at Achashverosh's palace. Okay, this is that first generation of exiled Jews dealing with what it means to be a diaspora Jew. And we saw that it was complicated. Jews going out, having a party, Achashverosh recognizing that there was a 70-year period where they were going to be exiled, but they knew they were going to come back to the land of Israel. And he brings out the clothing of the Kohen and the kelim, the vessels of the Mikdash as well. And they're celebrating with these other people, foreigners, and they're in exile. And we know how the story continues. Esther ends up getting that position. Mordechai eventually finds out about the plan of Haman to wipe out the Jews, and the story continues that he goes out and he rips off his clothing, he puts on sackcloth, puts on ash on his head, and he's mourning outside of the gates. He's mourning outside of the gates. And what ends up happening? It's a fascinating conversation that goes in the pasuk. Right, in the Psukim in the Megillah. It says as follows. It says, B'yom 13 l'chodesh Adar, the 13th of Adar, right? Noach ba'arba asa. No, not that one. Let's come back to that. It says, V'tive'ena. It says as follows. It says, V'tive'ena na'arot Esther b'siraseya v'yagidu la v'tichalchala hamalka me'od. V'tishach begadim halbish et Mordechai lahasir sako ma'ala v'lo kibel. She saw that that Mordechai was outside of the city gates, and he was wearing sackcloth. Okay, he was going ahead. He was mourning. He was crying. We got to go out. We have to do teshuvah. He wants to go ahead and ring the bells, get the Jews rallied up. How do we go ahead and stop this decree? You got to go out there, you got to cry, you got to scream, you got to feel that pain, you got to get on your knees, you got to get on the floor, you got to get dirty, it's got to get ugly. You got to go ahead and storm the heavens, you got to beseech God with tears. Feel the pain. Esther says, no, send Mordechai a suit. He should not be doing that. Mordechai refuses. So there's a fascinating dialogue that goes back and forth over here in the Midrashim. That Mordechai says to Esther, listen, the way in which Jews deal with negative decrees is that you go ahead and you mourn. And Esther says, no, that's not the way this works. The way this works is you go out, you put on your nicest clothing, and you stand tall and you're proud. B'simcha. And there's a machloket here between Mordechai and Esther as to what is the right approach to deal with the current situation the Jewish people are facing. Do we go out and do we cry, or do we go out and feel great and feel connected? Pasuk says earlier, B'yom Shlosheh Chodesh Adar, the 13th Adar, Noach ba'arba asar bo va'asa, that on the 13th day of the month of Adar they rested, and on the 14th day it says va'asa oto yom mishteh v'simcha, and it was made a day of mishteh and simcha, a day of drinking and happiness and merrymaking. But the word over there va'asa is weird because who did it? It should say va'asu oto yom mishteh v'simcha in the plural, but it says it in the singular. And then the next pasuk it says as follows. It says Vayudim asher b'Shushan nikalu b'shlosha asar ba'asar bo v'noach b'chamisha asar va'asa oto yom mishteh v'simcha. And then they actually did it. So here you have a pasuk which talks about this, a concept of doing something in the singular when really it should be in the plural. The Sfat Emet says that this concept of va'asa oto yom mishteh v'simcha is talking about God. That Adar, this Adar is not just a day of happiness for the Jewish people. It wasn't that they made it holy. It wasn't that they made it into a day of simcha and drinking. It's that God does. That everything in the material world itself is a reflection of something that's happening on a spiritual plane. And when that spiritual plane becomes the reality above, there's a mere reflection of what happens below. So that God is b'simcha on the 13th and 14th of Adar. And that's the day we're walking into. It's not just, the day that the Jews were saved. No, there's a spiritual reality of simcha that is emanating from a higher domain, and it comes down on the 13th and the 14th of the month. There's something profound about the month of Adar as far as it being the month chosen for simcha. Why? We know that the month of Adar is Pisces. We know that the dag, right, the fish, they get ayin hara lo shalat b'hem. There's no ayin hara. The yigdu larov, they're sprouting out. There's power there in riboy and being plentiful. That the fish have the power of being outside of ayin hara and still having this ability to go ahead and to create more without ayin hara. That's the power of the month of Adar. And therefore, if you have a choice of having a court case in any other month of the year, you want it to be an Adar because there's something especially profound about this unique month that no other month has. And there's lots of reasons for it. But the one key here, the key idea is, we talk about being b'simcha. That the way in which the Jews of Shushan dealt with Esther, making parties on purpose to take the Jews that were in exile, that were broken and depressed, and who were bent over because of the pain of losing the temple, the embarrassment of losing the land. She says the way in which we get out of this rut in exile is not through a place of sadness, it's through a place of simcha. Doubling down on this idea of simcha. Later on in the Megillah, when Haman finds out that he's going to be the one to tell Mordechai to go ahead and he's going to parade him around in the king's clothing and whatnot, right? So the Midrash says that Haman saw that Mordechai was praying. So he didn't want to disrupt him. So the Midrash says, well, why didn't he want to disrupt him? This is a perfect time to go ahead and do his evil stuff. You're the maniacal evil guy plotting. You're going to go ahead and you see the tzaddik praying, interrupt him, stop him. But he doesn't, he waits. Because Mordechai doesn't know about the news, about him being paraded around. So Haman understands that prayer from sadness and fear doesn't work. He lets him finish his tefillah because he knows he was out there crying. He knows that he was taking the sad approach. And tefillot that are coming from a sad place won't be answered. It's the tefillah of simcha. And then afterwards he goes out and he rides on the horse of the king and so on and so forth. He waits on purpose. Because the idea of Haman, the idea of Hamas and Amalek and all those people that are involved in terrorism and those horrific crimes that happen on that day, understand that the way in which you break a Jew is you attack simcha. Not an accident that this whole thing happened on Simchat Torah. Not an accident that we have the first Purim, and the question is, how do we respond to it? What do we do? But if you want to go ahead and look back into the Megillah and find answers, Esther says the way you deal with it is b'simcha, and she was right. She won that machloket. She won that idea that she recognized that the way in which you change reality is by taking people out of this negative state and bringing them into this positive state. At the end it says, V'yetze Haman b'yomahu, sameach v'tov lev. He goes out and he's happy. V'krot Haman et Mordechai b'shar hamelech. He's happy because v'lo kam v'lo zah. V'men v'limaleh Haman el Mordechai Hama. Right? He was happy to see him being in this negative state. But we know at the end of the story what happens. End of the story tells us that Haman is unhappy. Right? Haman is the one. He's the one. It says V'yeshev Mordechai al shar hamelech v'Haman nidchaf. Al beito aval v'chufoy rosh. He's the one that ends up, he's covering his head in mourning, and the story switches. That's the Ben HaPachu. The Ben HaPachu, the change, the flip of Purim is having one man who is the leader of the Jewish people. Imagine being the leader of the Jewish people, and on your watch, every single Jew is about to be wiped off the planet. You watched your family being uprooted from your homeland. The embarrassment of losing Israel. Having an army and not having an army. Going to a foreign land with a foreign ruler and a foreign decree to wipe out your people. By the man who goes ahead and carries this out, Haman, right? And he's going ahead, he's super happy, he's got all the money, he's got all the connections, and the whole thing flips. That's the flip we're talking about. And that flip could happen to all of us in any moment. The idea that sadness is something that we should be walking around with is the biggest lie. En atzivut ba'olam. There is no sadness. There's only simcha. That's why it's a mitzvah gedolah lihiyot besimcha. Whose choice is it to be besimcha? It's your choice to be besimcha. You choose, you decide whether or not you want to be simcha. There's this great quote that Rav Pam gives that I love. Rav Pam says as follows. He says that people are always searching for the city of happiness, but they don't realize that it's a state of mind. Right? Simcha is a choice. Simcha is a choice. So we know that we say Mishin Nichlas Adar Marba Misimcha. And this year, not an accident, we had 2 months of Adar. How many of us have tapped into the power of Adar? By the way, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that it's Adar Bet, and we still have a few days till Purim. Bad news is that you only have about 17 days of Adar left. So the good news is that it's not too late. Right? The bad news is that you missed out on almost 40 days of tapping into the power of Adar. It's a choice. Yes, there are challenges that we have to deal with. Yes, there are hardships. Yes, we acknowledge pain. But the question is, how am I going to respond to it? I've been teaching for the last few weeks on the Monday night classes about this idea of giving. And it's based on Rav Dessler's Kuntres Chesed. And I've been thinking a lot about this topic because I've been talking about it with different groups, and I've had like different ideas that have emerged as a result of the conversations. Rav Dessler says that every positive emotion stems from giving, and that flows outward from us to others, whereas every negative emotion revolves around taking for selfish motives. And therefore, when you are happiest, you are in a state of giving. When you are the most depressed and sad, it's because you are in a state of taking. Like Rabbi Mizrahi was saying earlier, when you could go ahead and spend your whole entire life chasing after the wrong sets of pleasures. You could distract yourself from all kinds of things, but whatever you're doing is not simcha. Simcha means something else. Simcha is the act of you engaging in the act of giving to someone else. Love means unconditionally. It means altruistically, complete, nothing else. I just want to give. Okay, I'm going to end with the following idea. We know that God is the ultimate giver. And we also know that God created man in his image. As a matter of fact, the Pasuk says very beautifully at in Bereshit that God goes ahead and he forms man out of the dust and he breathes into him the spirit of life. nishmat chaim. Vehi adam nefesh chaya, and man became a living being. And everyone asks, well, what is that pasuk talking about in Bereshit? Right? You just told me that you made man a living being, and then he says, by the way, man became a living being. Duh, God said he was a living being. Why do you got to repeat it twice? Onkelos points out that this idea of nefesh chaya means l'ruach memam lala, which means to a spirit that can speak. What is the correlation between being a speaker and being godly? That was the question I've been asking myself. And how is it correlated to Simcha and Adar and Purim? Pasuk in Mishlei says, Simcha la'ish b'ma'aneh b'piv. A ready response, right, gives a man a tremendous amount of happiness. The way a man responds with his mouth gives him simcha. And I have a suspicion there's a correlation here. I want to share this with you. Tell me what you think. There's nothing more profound than the power of speech. It's what separates us from every other creature on the planet. That I can stop and I could share with you something from the deepest parts of myself. I can pause and I could share a memory, a pain, something happy, a joke. I have the ability of challenging and channeling your mood through my words. My words have the power to be either super destructive, it could be insulting, or they be super constructive, it could be inspiring. We choose every single moment what comes out of our mouths. And maybe this is why when the Baal Shem Tov says that the word b'simcha has the same otiyot as machshava, he's talking about not just the thoughts lead to words. And therefore I would say that if you want to go ahead and tap into the power of simcha in the month of Adar, it's all about speech. What are you talking about? If everything you're speaking about is negative, no, then you're choosing to be negative. If you're surrounded by people that are speaking about negative things, don't be surprised if you're unhappy. They're going to bring you down. Simcha is an attitude, it's a mindset. You choose it. Esther chose it. She recognized that she was the most difficult of positions, ready to forfeit her life to save her people. And all that happened, if you actually read the Megillah and you spend some time looking at some of the commentary, and I recommend the Vilna Gaon, the Gra, every verse is a deep insight into human psychology. It's genius. It's brilliant. And every time Esther goes out and she's speaking to the Melech, we're not sure if she's speaking to Achashverosh or she's speaking to God. It's both. Right? You learn a deep psychological lesson about the nature of how we communicate with human beings and how we speak to God at the same time. The whole Megillah has to be read, it has to be heard, because it's about speech. You want to get ready for the miracles of Nisan? You have to be ready to accept the Simcha of Adar. The Ben Ish Chai asked the question, says, if we could go ahead and celebrate any double month in the calendar, why would you choose Adar? Right, just like we have a leap year, right? You could have that leap, you could have any 2 months in the calendar, why choose Adar? I would much rather have 2 months in Elul, 2 months to prepare for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. I'd rather have 2 months in Sivan, having an extra month of preparing for Matan Torah. Give me an extra month for Tshuva, give me an extra month for Torah. Why would you choose the month of Adar to make it a double month? Why this month, aside from the fact that it's the last month? The Ben Ish Chai says, because if you give a Jew 2 months of happiness, they could have Teshuvah and Torah. That's what it is. So my response to the people in those opinion columns, but whether or not we should cancel Purim, is absolutely not. You're missing the point. Purim is not just about a day of going out and getting wild and getting drunk. No. Purim is a day where you're asking yourselves, how am I becoming more godly? Because when I do that, when I align myself with my soul's mission in becoming more godly, that is how I bring simcha into the world. By choosing to use words that are constructive, by choosing to go ahead and be someone that is thinking mindfully about how I speak, how I elevate the world around me, that is how we change the world together. Bezrat Hashem, this Purim, before Purim even, today, as soon as possible, our hostages should be released. We should have all the Chayalim coming home unharmed and untouched. We should see the Geula b'mehera b'yameinu b'simcha. That's the way to do it. Have a great Purim, everybody. Thank you so much for coming.